Have you ever felt like the ground just disappeared beneath your feet? Like everything you once believed in, love, trust, the happily ever after, suddenly fell apart right before your eyes? That's exactly how the story of Isabella Montero began. An ordinary woman with simple dreams and a heart full of hope, who truly believed that love alone could protect her from life's storms. But life, sometimes, has a cruel way of teaching us. It breaks what isn't built to last. And there, at the altar, wearing her white dress and with tears in her eyes, Isabella discovered the most painful truth of all. The love she had idealized was nothing more than a reflection of her own unmet needs. The groom disappeared. The church fell silent. The looks of pity filled the room, and then her heart shattered into pieces. But you know what's most remarkable? That wasn't where her story ended. That's where it began. Because when life takes everything away from you, what remains is your essence. And that's where your real power lives. Dubai would be the most unlikely place for that power to be reborn. The desert, the luxury, the cultural shock, the judgmental stares, everything seemed to be working against her. But it's in the most distant places that Isabella found the unexpected, a new meaning, a new purpose, and a mysterious man. Adrian al-Maktoum, the millionaire who, without realizing it, would change her destiny forever. He didn't appear as a savior, but as a mirror, someone who also carried invisible wounds, and together, between cups of coffee and lingering glances, they would discover that true love isn't the one that completes you, it's the one that awakens you. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a story about chaos, rebirth, and the courage to rebuild yourself when your world falls apart. And maybe, deep down, it's also about you. Because if we really think about it, we've all been Isabella at some point. We've all believed in something or someone who wasn't ready to love us the way we deserved. But what separates those who sink from those who rise again is choice. Isabella chose not to be defined by her pain, and that choice led her to a life she could never have imagined. From a woman left at the altar, she became a symbol of strength, inspiration, and self-love in one of the most powerful cities in the world. And today, you're going to discover how that transformation happened. But before we dive into the story, tell me something. Where are you watching this video from? What city? What country? Leave a comment below. I want to see how far this story is reaching. And if you believe stories like this can touch people's hearts, make sure to subscribe, turn on the notifications, and leave a like, because what's coming next will move you in ways you might not be ready for. The sun was just beginning to rise shyly over the hills of Sintra, casting golden threads of light through the old windows of Isabella Montero's home. The smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery mixed with the distant sound of church bells, marking the start of another ordinary day. She wore the same blue wool sweater, her brown hair tied up in a simple bun. At 32, Isabella was a woman with a gentle soul and a dreamer's heart, a literature teacher who loved books, quiet cafes, and the almost childlike belief that love alone could heal the world. By the side of Ike, Lucas, her fiancé and partner of 5 years, she believed she had found the safety she'd always longed for. Her days revolved around preparing lessons, taking care of her sick mother, and planning the wedding that she thought would finally mark the beginning of her perfect life. Everything seemed to be in place, yet behind her soft eyes hid a quiet weariness, the kind that doesn't come from the body, but from a soul that has learned to shrink itself to keep others happy. Lucas was the kind of man who could charm anyone at first sight. Handsome, polite, successful in real estate, and fully aware of his own magnetism. But behind the sweet words lived a distant man, one more used to control than to love. Isabella ignored the signs, the long absences, the vague excuses, the heavy silences. She convinced herself that this was what adult love looked like, that true love required patience. Yet at night, lying beside him, she often stared at the ceiling and wondered why happiness always seemed to come with a quiet unease. There was an emptiness she couldn't name. Maybe it was the fear that the kind of love she had always believed in was nothing more than a beautiful illusion borrowed from her favorite books. Still, she kept believing. And when we believe hard enough, sometimes we stop seeing what's right in front of us. On autumn afternoons, Isabella would stroll along the cobblestone streets, watching the leaves fall, silent metaphors for something she was also losing without realizing it. The town was small. Everyone knew each other. She carried the title of Lucas's fiancée with pride. Her friends talked excitedly about the dress, the venue, the catering. She smiled and joined in, but deep inside something was quietly screaming for a deeper meaning, something beyond happily ever after. Deep down, Isabella felt she was living the life everyone expected of her, not the one she truly desired. And it's exactly in those moments of apparent stability that fate, silent and relentless, begins to move its pieces. Because life has a cruel talent for tearing down what we've built. Right when it's time to discover who we really are. The big day had finally arrived. The morning of the wedding began with the gentle fragrance of flowers decorating the small church of São Martinho in Sintra. The sky was clear, and a soft breeze made Isabella's veil dance, as if the universe itself were blessing her. Inside the parish room, she stood before the mirror. Her white lace dress looked like a dream woven from hope. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the emotion of someone who truly believed she was about to begin her forever. Behind her, her friend, Clara, longtime confidant and maid of honor, adjusted the final details of the bouquet. "He's going to cry when he sees you walking down the aisle," she said with a smile. Isabella laughed, half nervous, half in disbelief, unaware that fate was about to prove how even the most beautiful promises can collapse in a single moment. The church was full. The sound of the organ echoed through the stone walls, and the murmurs of the guests filled the air with expectation. Candles flickered softly, and the scent of white roses mingled with the altar's incense. Lucas. The groom hadn't arrived yet. Everyone assumed he was just running late. Isabella glanced toward the aisle, holding tightly to her father's arm. Mr. Antonio, who was to walk her down the aisle, but minutes turned into half an hour, then an hour. The solemn silence slowly shifted into unease. The priest, visibly uncomfortable, whispered something to Clara, who tried to mask her panic. Then came a phone call, a short message, and the look on Clara's face shattered into 1,000 pieces. Lucas wasn't coming. No explanation. No reason. Just emptiness. The same emptiness Isabella had felt before, but chosen to ignore. Time seemed to stop. Laughter faded. Eyes turned away. The music went silent. Isabella stood frozen, as if her heart had forgotten how to beat. Tears rolled slowly down her face, ruining the makeup she had so carefully applied. The shame burned even more than the heartbreak. It wasn't just love that was falling apart, but her dignity, her dream, her identity as the woman who was supposed to be chosen. The humiliation was public, but the pain was deeply private. Outside, the once gentle breeze had turned cold, and the veil that had danced with the wind now lay torn on the ground. Nietzsche once said that chaos is the price of transformation. And as the church bells echoed in vain, Isabella took her first step into the unknown. She didn't know it yet, but that no at the altar would become the most painful and the most liberating invitation of her entire life. The days following the wedding that never happened were a thick, suffocating fog. Isabella woke up and went to sleep in the same emptiness, surrounded by memories that screamed inside her mind. The dress, now tucked away in the corner of her closet, seemed to mock her with its untouched purity. The bouquet, already dry, still rested on the dresser, a symbol of everything that had withered without warning. Outside, life went on. Church bells rang, people whispered on street corners, and pitying glances followed her like shadows. The humiliation had escaped the church walls and spread through the town like smoke. The bride left at the altar. No one knew what to say, so they said too much. Isabella, once gentle and kind to everyone, now avoided even her own reflection. The light that once filled her eyes had been replaced by a quiet pain, a kind of exhaustion that comes not from the body, but from the soul. The curtains in her home stayed closed. The sound of the world outside felt too harsh. Helena, her childhood friend who now lived in Dubai, called every day, urging her to go out, to breathe, to start again. But Isabella didn't want to listen. Love, to her, had become a minefield. Each attempt at comfort only made her retreat further. Sometimes she'd spend hours sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon without really seeing it. Her mind replayed the same questions over and over. Why? What did I do wrong? What was so unlovable about me that he had to run away like that? The answers never came. The world seemed to punish the naive, those who still believed in happy endings. It was as if the universe had stripped away her last spark of hope, leaving behind only survival. Yet, buried beneath the apathy, something faint began to stir, an unease she couldn't quite name. A quiet whisper within her, almost imperceptible, suggested that maybe this pain carried a hidden purpose. It was strange, as if the emptiness itself wanted to speak. On some nights, while reading old love letters, Isabella found herself wondering if all of this wasn't a sign that it was time to look inward. But fear held her back. The fear of discovering that she had lived not out of love, but out of need. The fear of realizing that for years she had shaped her life to fit inside someone else's dreams. And when a woman begins to sense that truth, something within her starts to awaken, slowly, quietly, and always at the cost of her own pain. It was a cold, silent afternoon when the phone rang, the sound cutting through the heavy stillness of the house like an unexpected invitation to life. On the other end of the line was Helena's voice, gentle yet firm, traveling across the distance between Portugal and Dubai. Isabella, you need to leave that place. You need to breathe new air. Come here. Not to run away, but to find yourself. There was silence. Isabella swallowed hard. She had been avoiding long conversations for weeks, but there was something in Helena's tone, a calm, almost maternal strength, that stirred a faint spark of curiosity inside her. Helena spoke about Dubai as if describing a portal. The sun shines differently here, Isa. It's a place where people rebuild their stories every single day. Maybe what you lost wasn't love. It was the space to rediscover who you are. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. Helena's words echoed in her chest like a heartbeat that refused to fade. A few days later, in a moment she couldn't fully explain, Isabella bought a one-way ticket. She left a note on the kitchen table for her mother, saying she needed time. The Lisbon airport felt like a maze of emotions, fear, guilt, and hope all colliding inside her. When the plane took off, tears streamed down her face. But for the first time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. Hours later, when she landed in Dubai, she was greeted by intense heat and a landscape that looked like another world entirely. The air smelled of spices and promises. The contrast between the futuristic skyscrapers and the endless desert mirrored the conflict inside her. Luxury and loneliness, past and rebirth, pain and possibility. Helena took her to explore Al-Fahidi, an old neighborhood filled with narrow alleys and honey-colored walls. There, Isabella met Amara, a middle-aged woman who owned a small cafe called The Golden Date. Amara was the kind of person who seemed to see beyond what the eyes could show. With a calm voice and an enigmatic smile, she handed Isabella a cup of cardamom coffee and said, "A woman who discovers her worth, my dear, doesn't ask for love, she inspires it." The words struck Isabella like a quiet lightning bolt. In that moment, something inside her awakened. It was as if Amara had lit a small flame in the dark. The young Portuguese woman, lost, hurt, and uncertain, began to understand that pain, sometimes, is simply the language life uses to call us to awaken. The sun was rising over the desert when Isabella, woke up to her first morning in Dubai. From the window of the small apartment that Helena had arranged for her in Bur, Dubai, she could see the horizon painted in shades of orange and gold. The warm breeze carried the scent of spices, mixed with the distant sounds of the city coming to life. The hum of luxury cars on wide avenues contrasted with the soft, melodic call to prayer echoing from the minarets. It was as if the world itself whispered, with both gentleness and grandeur, "Welcome to your second chance." Isabella took a deep breath. She was afraid, yes, but there was also something she hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. For the first time, she was in a place where no one knew her, where her past couldn't chase her, and that sense of anonymity was liberating. She had traded the damp cold of Sintra for the blazing heat of the Middle East, the gray walls of her home for the vibrant, colorful streets of a city pulsing with life at every corner. On her first day working at the Golden Date Cafe, Amara handed her a sand-colored apron and a knowing smile. "Here, we don't just serve coffee, Isabella," she said softly. "We serve presence, and presence heals." The cafe had a cozy warmth, dark wooden tables, soft curtains, and the rich aroma of cardamom coffee floating through the air. Customers from all over the world came and went, each face carrying its own story. Isabella watched them with curious, learning eyes, fascinated by the human mosaic that Dubai seemed to be. Among hurried tourists, sharp-suited businessmen, and local women draped in elegant veils, she began to understand something powerful. The world was much larger than her pain, and maybe, just maybe, suffering had been the ticket that brought her to this new version of herself. One afternoon, while serving a tray of Arabic sweets to a group of executives, Isabella's eyes met those of a man sitting alone by the window. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit and seemed completely absorbed in his laptop. There was something serene about him, yet distant. His name was Adrian Al Maktoum, a British entrepreneur who had lived in Dubai for years, known for his vast tech empire and his almost legendary solitude. Isabella had no idea who he was, but Adrian had noticed her long before. There was something about her, the way she smiled with quiet grace, even while her eyes still carried traces of sorrow, that intrigued him deeply. And there, between the aroma of coffee and the hum of conversation, their paths crossed for the very first time. Unknowingly, Isabella had just crossed the threshold, leaving behind the woman she once was, and beginning the journey toward the woman destiny had been patiently waiting for her to become. The weeks that followed were a quiet test of strength. Isabella worked hard to adapt to the fast-paced rhythm of Dubai, a city where luxury seemed to breathe from every corner. The days were long, the heat nearly unbearable, and the cultural differences demanded more than just adaptation. They demanded humility. At the Golden Date Cafe, she served coffee to impatient executives, curious tourists, and businessmen who judged people by the watches on their wrists. Sometimes, customers treated her with indifference as if she were invisible. Other times, they complimented her smile with a thin layer of condescension. But Amara, always observant, Onkis would remind her, "My dear, those who serve the world with kindness never serve in vain." And so, between trays and cups of coffee, Isabella began collecting small victories, a customer's sincere thank you, a child's smile when receiving a sweet, or the simple comfort of coming home exhausted but at peace. Helena, always nearby, became her safe harbor. She would take Isabella for long evening walks along Dubai Marina, where the cool Gulf breeze brought gentle relief after the scorching days. There, between laughter and conversations about the past, Isabella started to rediscover who she was without Lucas. She was no longer the bride left at the altar. She was simply herself, a woman learning to enjoy her own company. But while her heart was quietly rebuilding, a new presence began to draw closer. Adrian Al Maktoum, the man in the gray suit, had become a regular at the cafe. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, no sugar, and a slice of date cake. He sat at the same table every time, observing the world outside the window, occasionally letting his gaze rest almost unintentionally on Isabella. He was reserved, almost unreachable. Yet there was something in his demeanor, a quiet sorrow, that seemed to speak the same language as her pain. Amara was the first to notice. "His eyes are searching for what yours have already learned to hide," she said one afternoon, stirring coffee with her usual calm. Isabella laughed it off, deflecting. She wasn't ready to dream again. Not yet. The echoes of broken promises still haunted her. But destiny, sly as ever, was already weaving the threads that would soon intertwine their stories. At the same time, a new challenge appeared. Omar, the cafe's manager. A strict and competitive man, he seemed to take pleasure in reminding Isabella that she was just another foreigner. His criticisms were constant, his demands excessive. But Isabella learned how to handle him, not with submission, but with intelligence. She discovered that kindness, when paired with firmness, can disarm even the hardest of hearts. And so, facing the heat, exhaustion, and judgments, she slowly began to earn the respect she once thought impossible. Without realizing it, every challenge Dubai placed in her path was shaping her into a new version of herself. Stronger, more confident, and finally, the woman of her own making. It was late afternoon in Dubai. The sun sank slowly behind the glass towers, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and rose. The city shimmered in gold, its reflection spreading across the streets like a carpet of fire. Isabella was wiping down the last tables at the cafe when she heard a deep, calm voice behind her. "Do you always end your shift smiling like that? Or is it just a Thursday privilege?" She turned, startled. Adrian Al-Maktoum stood at the counter, leaning casually, his gaze a mix of curiosity and admiration. His tone carried an elegant blend of kindness and irony. Isabella laughed softly, a bit embarrassed. "The smile is just my way of hiding how tired I really am." That was their first real conversation, the spark that would ignite many more. In the days that followed, Adrian began visiting more often. Their talks, once brief and polite, grew longer and deeper. He didn't speak much about himself, but when he did, there was weight in his words. He told her about losing his parents at a young age, and how loneliness had become a quiet companion, even among luxury cars and glittering penthouses. Isabella listened intently. Beneath the image of the powerful businessman, she sensed a man carrying invisible scars of his own. In time, Adrian invited her to join him on a philanthropic project, an initiative focused on empowering women in vulnerable situations. The goal was to teach them skills and help them achieve financial independence. Isabella hesitated, doubting she was ready for such responsibility. But Amara, ever wise, said, "My dear, when life calls you to something that feels bigger than you, that's the sign it's exactly where you're meant to be." And so, she accepted. Over the following months, their work brought them closer. They spent hours together, reviewing reports, visiting institutions, listening to the stories of women who had been betrayed, abandoned, and humiliated. Their pain echoed pieces of Isabella's own story. Between meetings, laughter began to slip through the cracks. Sometimes, a fleeting touch of their hands during a discussion was enough to send sparks through the air. Something unspoken lingered between them, quiet yet undeniable. One night, after a long day of visits in the desert, Adrian's car stopped atop a dune. The sky was dusted with stars, and the warm wind carried hints of sand and distant sea salt. He turned to her and said softly, "You know, Isabella, the desert reminds me of you, calm on the surface, but holding a quiet strength within." She smiled, trying to look away, though her heartbeat betrayed her calm. In that moment, something shifted. The desert seemed to hold its breath, and for the first time since that day at the altar, Isabella felt the desire to believe again. Not in the fairy tale version of love, but in the kind that grows slowly, between wounds, courage, and shared scars. But destiny, ever the master of timing, was already preparing a storm to test this fragile, newfound hope. It was a grand night, the launch event for the social project that Isabella and Adrian had built together was being held in one of the most luxurious halls of Dubai Marina, a space overflowing with crystal chandeliers, classical music, and the scent of exotic flowers mingled with power. Dressed in an elegant navy blue gown that Amara had helped her choose, Isabella felt her heart race, not just because of the magnitude of the evening, but because of Adrian. He stood across the room in a perfectly tailored black suit, his gaze never leaving her. It was the pinnacle of what had felt like months of rebirth. The women who once lived on the margins now had voices. Investors applauded. The speeches flowed one after another. Everything pointed to a universe that at last seemed to smile upon her. But destiny, that old playwright, still had one last act waiting. During the event, a tall, arrogant man named Richard Collins, Adrian's business rival, approached the press with a cruel intention. He presented forged documents suggesting that Isabella had leaked confidential data from Adrian's company in exchange for money. The news spread like wildfire. Camera flashes erupted, whispers turned to murmurs, and the air grew thick with suspicion. Isabella stood frozen, her mind struggling to catch up. She saw faces turn toward her, saw trust dissolve in an instant. Her eyes searched desperately for Adrian. He stood motionless, torn between confusion and disbelief. "Say something," she whispered, her voice trembling, but he said nothing, and his silence screamed louder than any accusation ever could. In that moment, everything collapsed again. The ground gave way beneath her feet, and the memory of that church, of the day she had been left at the altar, came rushing back like a cruel ghost. Once more, she was humiliated. Not privately, but publicly, in front of the world. The same world that now mocked her naive belief that love could ever be safe. She ran from the ballroom, the hem of her dress tearing at the door, her heels in her hands, tears streaming down her face and blending with the hot desert wind. The streets of Dubai blurred beneath the glow of the skyscrapers. "Why again?" she cried to herself. "What did I do to deserve this? Again?" She wandered until she reached Jumeirah Beach, where she finally collapsed onto the sand, sobbing. The sea, calm and indifferent, kept rolling in soft waves, as if whispering, "Life doesn't punish you, Isabella. It teaches you." But she couldn't believe that. Not yet. At that moment, all she could feel was the pain, and the certainty that love was nothing but a cruel illusion, a mirror that shattered every time she dared to see herself reflected in it. In the days that followed, she disappeared. She moved to a small, distant neighborhood, cut contact with everyone, even Helena and Amara. The project was temporarily shut down. Her name tarnished. Alone in a small apartment overlooking the desert, Isabella sank into silence. It felt like the end. Again. But destiny, tireless as ever, does not close the chapters of souls that still have something to learn. And on nights when the wind carried the faint scent of coffee and warm sand, she could almost hear it, that same whisper she had once heard at the beginning of her journey, reminding her that even the desert blooms after the storm. The months that followed were marked by silence and rebuilding. Isabella had withdrawn from the world, from the city, from the people who once meant everything. Her small apartment in Al-Satwa, modest and unassuming, had become her refuge. The white walls echoed sleepless nights, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of coffee and cinnamon, the only luxury she still allowed herself. Each morning, she would watch the sun rise over the rooftops, and little by little, something inside her began to shift. It was no longer sorrow that accompanied her, but a quiet, melancholic serenity. One day, while walking through the dusty streets of her neighborhood, she saw a little girl selling homemade sweets. And in that simple moment, inspiration struck. She would transform what remained of her pain into something sweet. And so, Aurora Custom was born, a small artisanal bakery that began in her own kitchen. The name came from what she desired most: a new dawn. With the help of Amara, who never stopped searching for her, Isabella slowly reconnected with the world. Amara visited every week, bringing ingredients, advice, and her quiet wisdom. "The secret of sugar is the same as the secret of life," she'd say, stirring a pot of caramel. "It takes fire to reach the right point." And it was in the fire of her pain that Isabella found her strength. Her recipes, cakes, sweets, and cookies blending Portuguese and Arabian touches, began to attract attention. Social media, which she had once avoided, became her window of hope. Women from different countries started following her page, drawn not just to her desserts, but to the unspoken story behind them. Without realizing it, Isabella had become a symbol of resilience. What once filled her with shame now inspired others. One afternoon, a customer told her, "Your cake tastes like a new beginning." And Isabella smiled. For the first time in years, it was a real smile. She no longer felt anger toward Lucas, nor resentment toward Adrian. She understood now. They had each been mirrors, reflecting back the lessons she needed to see in herself. At night, when she closed the small counter of her bakery, she often looked up at Dubai's sky, a tapestry of light and contrast, and realized the city itself was a metaphor. The desert and the luxury, the emptiness and the abundance, coexisting side by side. The woman who had once been left at the altar was now the author of her own story. And though the past sometimes whispered, the loudest sound was now her own voice, steady, calm, and full of purpose. But the universe, in its poetic irony, has a way of testing us just when we think we've finally found peace. And it was at the height of her newfound serenity that Adrian returned, carrying not only his remorse, but a truth that would once again change everything. It was a calm afternoon in Dubai when the familiar chime of the cafe door rang. Isabella, busy behind the counter at Aurora, looked up absent-mindedly, and for a brief moment, time stood still. Standing before her was Adrian al-Maktoum. Not the confident man she once knew, but someone changed. His eyes weary, his shoulders slightly slumped, his expression carrying the delicate weight of guilt and tenderness. The contrast between the elegant man in a tailored suit and the invisible heaviness of remorse was almost poetic. For several seconds, silence filled the air, heavy, dense, almost tangible. The scent of vanilla and caramelized sugar mixed with his woody cologne, stirring memories she thought she had long buried. "Isabella." His voice was softer than she remembered. "I came to ask for your forgiveness." She stood still, observing him. Part of her wanted to cry, another wanted to laugh, and a third part simply wanted to understand why fate insisted on bringing the past back when she had finally learned how to move forward. Then Adrian spoke. He explained everything. How Richard Collins' curse, deceit had been exposed, how the false accusations had been proven lies. The evidence clearing Isabella's name was now in his hands. But what hurt her most wasn't the injustice. It was his silence. "I didn't trust you," he said, his voice breaking, "and that was the biggest mistake of my life." Isabella took a deep breath. There was no anger in her, only a strange, gentle peace. "You didn't believe in me because, deep down, I didn't believe in myself either," she replied calmly. Adrian lowered his eyes, defeated not by her words, but by the truth she now carried with quiet strength. She invited him to sit, served him coffee and a slice of date cake, the same one he used to order in the old days. This time, the silence between them was different. It wasn't prideful or distant. It was a silence of understanding. That afternoon, they talked for hours, about the past, about fear, about what love becomes when it isn't built on trust. Adrian confessed that he had spent months searching for her, afraid it was too late. "Maybe it still is," Isabella said, gazing out the window. But that doesn't mean forgiveness has no place between us. There was firmness in her tone. She was no longer the woman who waited to be rescued. She was the woman who had learned to save herself. In the days that followed, Adrian began visiting her more often. There were no promises, no rush, just two hearts trying to rediscover each other with honesty. For Isabella, it was strange to see him there again. The man who embodied both love and pain, the past and the possibility of the future. But deep down, she knew this was the final stage of her healing. To face what once wounded her and realize it no longer bled. The sun was setting over the Dubai desert, and the city seemed to breathe in silence. Outside, the horizon burned in shades of copper and gold, while the hot wind carried grains of sand that danced like small memories suspended in time. Isabella walked beside Adrian, in a twilight that felt suspended between what had been and what could still be. Since their reunion, they had met several times, not like before, not with promises, but with presence. The weight of words had been replaced by simple gestures, a walk, a coffee, a conversation too long for any clock to measure. But that evening felt different. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. They stopped at the edge of the dunes, the same place where, months earlier, he had told her she was like the desert, calm on the surface, yet holding a quiet strength within. This time, she smiled at the memory. "You were right, Adrian," she said, gazing at the horizon. "The desert is calm, but it's also where storms are born." He looked at her, surprised. "And you've faced every one of yours." She took a deep breath, feeling the warm wind brush against her face. "Yes, but the hardest part wasn't forgiving you. It was forgiving myself, for believing I needed someone's love to feel whole." Her words echoed in the air like a prayer. It was the climax of her journey, the moment when Isabella ceased being the victim of her pain and became the author of her own redemption. Adrian's eyes filled with tears as he stepped closer. "I don't expect you to come back to me," he said softly. "I just want you to know that even without you, I finally learned what it means to truly love." She smiled, a calm, mature, beautiful smile. "Then you finally understand," she replied. "Love isn't about possession, it's about freedom." The words lingered between them like the final ray of sunlight before nightfall. And in that instant, Isabella felt something she had never known before. Not passion, not longing, but peace. The kind of peace that only comes when the soul completes its cycle of pain and growth. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, she closed her eyes for a moment. The words of Bonhoeffer echoed in her mind. "Freedom is not the right to do what we want, but the power to become who we are meant to be." She was finally free, free from the past, from expectations, from fear, and ironically, it was that very freedom that made love possible again. When she opened her eyes, Adrian extended his hand, not to possess her, but simply to walk beside her, and she accepted. Not like before, but as someone who consciously chooses a love that doesn't bind, but walks alongside. Time passed, and with it, the wounds finally healed. The city of Dubai, once the backdrop of her pain and rebirth, now pulsed in harmony with the new rhythm of Isabella Montero's life. Her bakery, Aurora, had grown into a symbol of hope. Its windows displayed flawless pastries, but it was the energy of the place that truly drew people in. Women from all walks of life came not only to buy desserts, but to hear the words of a woman who had faced her own darkness and overcome it. Isabella greeted each customer with a serene smile, fully aware of who she had been and who she had become. There was no longer shame in her name, nor shadows in her story. Every cake, every cup of coffee, every shared conversation was a living reminder that even the most broken stories can be rewritten with sweetness. Meanwhile, Adrian had transformed their social project into a foundation, the Aurora Foundation, named in honor of their shared new beginning. Together, they opened centers to support women in vulnerable situations, offering training, housing, and opportunities to rebuild their lives. What had once been a professional partnership born from circumstance had evolved into a shared purpose. And between one meeting and the next, between laughter and quiet glances, love returned, not as a consuming fire, but as a steady flame, warm, constant, and secure. They never needed another altar. They had already chosen each other, every day, in every small act of kindness, in every moment of unspoken understanding. One calm evening, Isabella and Adrian returned to the desert, the same place where they had once faced their fears. Beneath the vast starry sky, he took her hand and said, "You taught me what love truly is. It's not about promising forever. It's about being fully present." She smiled, eyes glistening with restrained tears. "And you taught me that there's no such thing as abandonment when we learn not to abandon ourselves." The wind blew softly, and the silence between them was the most beautiful they had ever shared. The desert, once a symbol of loneliness, now witnessed fulfillment. Isabella, the woman who had once been left at the altar, was now whole, loved, free, and at peace. She hadn't become who she once was. She had become something greater, the version of herself destiny had always known she could be. And as the stars shimmered in her eyes, one truth became clear. The real altar had always been within her, the sacred place where self-love, faith, and new beginnings meet. Because, in the end, the woman who was once abandoned never truly lost love. She found it within herself.